The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Terrorism, Protection of Premises Bill, as amended in the committee, to be considered.
Now, we will begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call Matt Vickers to move new clause 1.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the clause be read a second time. I want to pay tribute to everyone who's contributed to Martin's Law campaign, the incredible group of individuals at Survivors Against Terror, all of the businesses, charities, local authorities, civil servants and security partners who've helped shape the bill, and most importantly, the tireless campaigner Fegan Murray and her son Martin, in whose name this bill has been devised. I'd also like to reflect for a moment on Martin and the 21 other innocent victims who were killed in the heinous attack in the Manchester Arena in 2017. Their lives, loss and the pain of their families and friends must never be forgotten. I'd like to pass on the apologies of the Honourable Member for Rutland and Stamford, who's unable to be present today to speak on behalf of the official opposition. Martin's Law was a manifesto pledge for the Conservative Party, and we published a version of that legislation in draft during the last Parliament. We take the issue of public protection very seriously when in office. We delivered £1 billion of counter-terrorism funding for 24-25, so our forces can mount a swift and effective response to any terrorist attack. Funding will total at least £1 billion in 24-25, as we provided essential support for counter-terrorism policing and ensured the police had the resources they needed to meet and deal with the threat of terrorism. Enshrined our Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Act into law, introducing tougher sentences and ending the automatic release of potential terrorist offenders. Those found guilty of serious terror offences will now be handed a minimum 14-year prison term and up to 25 years on licence. Part of the reason for publishing the legislation in draft was out of a concern to get the balance right in terms of the different premises to which the legislation applies, their responsibilities, how feasible it is for them to effectively comply with those responsibilities and with public safety. We're grateful to the Home Affairs Select Committee, who undertook pre-legislative scrutiny of this legislation and made valuable recommendations. All those who responded to the Home Office consultation as well. It is because Martin's Law is so important that it's imperative we get it right in this place. It's in that spirit of support, cooperation and openness that we've suggested small amendments to the bill to be debated today. New Clause 1 would require the Secretary of State to produce a report into the effectiveness of the Security Industry Authority as the regulator of these new provisions for both this House and other places within 18 months of the passing of this Act. This is in recognition of the challenges inherent in extending new regulatory powers to an existing body. The report would include a comparative cost-benefit analysis of the SIA's regulatory functions and an analysis of the implications if those functions were alternatively carried out at the local authority level. The SIA's role in this bill is extensive, and it's our view that a review after the rollout of the new provisions will provide the Government with the opportunity to take stock and decide whether the existing arrangements are the most effective regulatory framework. If they're a success, fantastic. If there are issues, it is surely best to address them early on and, if necessary, make changes then and there. I know there's been some anxiety from organisations over a perceived lack of clarity in how the SIA will approach regulation and whether it has the institutional dexterity to understand such a diverse range of venues. From my own discussions with relevant representative groups, businesses and venue operators around the country, I know there is a wide-ranging support for the changes in our amendment from the industry. They want to ensure their venues are as safe as they can be. Indeed, many have already taken steps unilaterally to improve security and are eager to work with government on further progress. However, there is a feeling that current advice and guidance is limited, and this lack of information is leading to anxiety, particularly at a time when business confidence is falling and new taxes are incoming. Therefore, I'd ask the Government to ensure affected venues and industries are given full advice on how to comply with the incoming regulations as soon as possible. By agreeing to a future review of the SIA's regulatory effectiveness now, the Government can ease those anxieties that do exist and ensure everyone is focused on the most important thing, the delivery of the provisions in this bill and the bolstering of our collective security going forwards. It's for that reason I ask the Government to support new Clause 1. With regards to Amendment 27, it's in a similar spirit of openness and cooperation that we've tabled Amendment 27. This amendment would prevent the Secretary of State from increasing by regulations the daily penalty venues can be fined under this legislation. As the bill stands, those venues classifying as standard duty can be fined up to £500 per day for violation. Those classed as enhanced duty venues, £50,000 per day of violation. I know the Minister will have met with many of the organisations required to make changes due to this legislation. I'm sure he, like me, found them to be actively supportive of these changes and genuinely interested in working collaboratively towards better safety regulations.
Will the Minister give way?
I will.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister giving way. Isn't the point here that without the regulations and the guidelines set out clearly, then there's a risk that businesses are going to worry about being fined quite heavily, just because they don't quite know what they're doing. So the clarity that we have by using New Clause 1 and indeed this amendment would help to cement that in place.
I think that all of these venues, all the people in the industry are genuinely committed to improving the safety of their venues, in fact, wholeheartedly on that front. But actually it's about the anxieties, it's about the concerns of what this means. And actually, if we move back to that review of who's in charge and who's responsible for ensuring compliance, it will get rid of those anxieties, it will fill confidence amongst the industry and let us move forwards together with the industry. We'd like reassurance about how the Government intends to use the powers to increase the rate of daily penalties. The bill allows the SIA to levy large fines for non-compliance with the requirements of this legislation, in addition to the daily penalties. From a sector recovering from COVID, these could be difficult to meet, as could a daily penalty of £500 levied on a small organisation run by volunteers. We've heard from several trade associations about the potential impact. Neil Sharpley, Policy Chair of the Federation of Small Business, said the FSB are broadly supportive of the bill, but that they're concerned about the administrative burden that will be imposed on smaller businesses. Mr Sharpley said, "We're concerned about the administrative impact of the burden that will be imposed on smaller businesses, and we're concerned about the costs involved." Michael Kill, CEO of the Nighttime Industry Association, said it's crucial to address the proportionality of the proposed measures. Mr Kill said it's crucial to address the proportionality of these measures within all settings. We must ensure that the balance between heightened security and practical implementation is carefully considered. We will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he will know that I took this through as Shadow Minister at second reading, and I welcome the Minister in his place and thank him for his usual courtesy. But does my honourable friend agree with me that with some other measures, and this is genuinely not a political point, but with some other measures that are currently burdening small business, such as increases in taxation and increases with business rates and national insurance contributions, that this amendment that we have laid down exactly it helps them, because it allows them to plan and it allows them to make sure that not too much costs are going out, particularly charities and smaller venues. And that's why the remit of the SIA must be checked, and that's why this amendment should be backed.
Agree more. I think at a time of huge anxiety amongst businesses, of challenges and pressures, whether it be the national insurance contribution increases on employers, whether it be the huge change to small business rate relief affecting small businesses in leisure, hospitality and retail, slashing it down from 75% to 40%. These are challenging times, often for very small family businesses. Equally, as he points out, for the voluntary sector and lots of organisations that prop up our communities and play a central role. These are things that, by perfecting this bill, we can relieve those anxieties, allow these organisations to follow on with confidence, complying with the measures brought forward in this bill. So I'd appreciate some reassurance from the Minister about how he expects to use the powers to change daily penalties, and in doing so demonstrate that the ethos of this bill is collaboration between the state and private organisations, not the establishment of an increasingly costly financial penalisation system. We believe this would help to settle any underlying anxieties and allow both the government and venues to focus on working together to ensure the rollout of this bill is the very best that it can be. With regards to Amendments 25 and 26, stopping the Secretary of State changing qualifying tier amounts by regulation, Amendments 25 and 6 are simple and are designed to provide future certainty to organisations as they work to become compliant with the provisions of this bill. They'd remove the power for the Secretary of State to lower the threshold for the standard duty premises and enhanced duty premises from 200 and 799 respectively. The current qualification levels have been determined after consultation and pre-legislative scrutiny. These are significant policy choices, and I believe the government has reached this position after listening to that feedback. As I've set out today, industry and venues are supportive of this bill, are actively supportive of this bill and actively want to play their part in improving venue security. We do worry about the potential uncertainty that's caused by the potential for the Secretary of State to change the thresholds for the standard and enhanced duty in the future. How will this power be compatible with allowing the industry to plan long-term, knowing the qualifying criteria for each tier will not change? We'd like to make sure that venues have the confidence to commit the required resources to adopting the provisions of the bill, knowing the rules will not change suddenly. Impact assessments have shown the challenges facing different types of venues, smaller premises, places of worship, village halls and community centres, those from smaller capacity premises and from places of worship, etc., showed particular concern for the impact on fellow smaller businesses and their ability to meet the revised requirement within the small resources available to them. Among respondents from premises with a capacity of 100 to 299, around 4 in 10, 39%, agreed that those responsible for premises within the standard tier should have a legal obligation to be prepared for a terrorist attack. Nearly half, 46%, of those who disagreed said they believe only larger premises should have a legal obligation. Around half, 51%, reported that revised requirements would be difficult to take forward. 6 in 10, 58%, were at least somewhat concerned that the cost of meeting the standard tier requirements will affect their organisation's financial ability to continue operating. And amongst those from places of worship or village halls, only around 3 in 10 of those agreed that those responsible for premises with standard tier should have a legal obligation to be prepared for a terrorist attack. Over 54% of those from village hall and community centres, which typically had a smaller capacity than premises across other sectors, 72% had a capacity of 100 to 109, disagreed, said they believe only larger premises should have a legal obligation. Over half of those from places of worship and village halls felt the revised requirement would be difficult to take forwards, mainly due to perceived burden in terms of time and effort. I would therefore like to ask the Minister in what circumstances he would envisage needing to lower the floor for either standard or enhanced duty premises, and what consultation would take place before the government did so. Thank you.
Would my honourable friend agree with me that the issue of proportionality is particularly important? And while clearly venues like the Manchester Arena should have a properly worked out plan, it's inappropriate for village halls and church halls to worry about the cost and bureaucracy involved, and can we have the lightest possible touch for those small community venues?
Yeah. Look at the organisations that are affected, whether it be those parish halls, village halls, whether it be those churches, those community organisations that sit at the heart of our community are invaluable to the functioning of so many communities, coupled with those small businesses, whether it be the local pub, the local community, whatever it might be. These things lie at the heart of our community. It's essential that we protect them, and there is a balance. There is a balance between what all of the people in support of this bill, what this side and that side want, in terms of the protections we give to prevent some of the most horrific atrocities that we've seen occur, but also in ensuring that those businesses, those community organisations can continue to exist going forwards.
Would my honourable friend give...
Yep.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I would just argue with him that when you look at those that are not in the enhanced tier, that are below the enhanced tier, the provisions in the bill as it stands are actually, I would argue, appropriate. They are proportionate, they are low cost, they are not onerous, they actually encourage organisations to do they're prompts to do the kinds of thinking that they should do anyway, and to prevent terrorists, to prevent any kinds of attacks. They're not disproportionate at all, and the legislation as it stands is appropriate in this respect.
And where it's coming from. I think that when you look at the idea that the regulatory body that oversees this, the idea of an 18 months coming back and looking, it's an existing body that's being given an additional job. I don't think there's any harm in coming back to that in 18 months to review that and whether it's working, whether it's fit for purpose or not. Similarly, a lot of the things around the changes in figures, in fees that might be applied and penalties. I think there's logic in this House having a say in that going forwards rather than it being delegated to the Secretary of State. I think those are logical changes that can just relieve some of the anxieties in the sector. Everybody wants to see this bill go forward. Everybody wants it to fulfil its objective in making our community safer. But some of the anxieties in the sector and the impact, the unexpected and unintended consequences for some of those community venues and some of those small businesses is real. Let's relieve some of those anxieties by putting these things in place. Yes?
I thank the Shadow Minister, and I hope he forgives me for intervening once again. But on the point about the responsible person element, this was a concern that I raised when I was at the dispatch box at second reading, that, as he has outlined, the smaller charity voluntary sector functions, such as theatres or community organisations, of course, like me, welcome the aims of this bill. But when you have a voluntary organisation that are responsible for allocating someone who is legally responsible under the jurisdiction of the SIA, that spreads fear amongst that community organisation with the bureaucracies that they already have. So does he agree with me that we do need to look very, very carefully at how much burden we are putting on theatre groups, but in particular voluntary community associations that would be subject to the regulations being put forward?
I think reflecting, taking the time, looking at the fact that we can review this in 18 months about how it's regulated. Actually, we know already that many of our community organisations, many voluntary organisations already struggle to find the manpower they need to fulfil their functions. This is another function, rightly in purpose. It's the right thing to do to take this forward and provide those protections, but we've got to consider it in perspective, in proportionality to some of those smaller venues and the impact it can have on communities. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way on that point. And I have to, it's not in my register of interest, I don't think, but I'm a church warden of a small parish church. Most parish churches would probably come under the 200 limit, but the vast majority would be caught by 100 plus. Does he recognise the real fear that not only will there be fear from volunteers who have to take on this responsibility, but there would be the very significant risk of unintended consequences of volunteers not being prepared to take this responsibility, and as a result, really vitally important community infrastructure spaces closing to the public as a terrible unintended consequence of this well-meaning bill?
You're right. I think actually when you look at the numbers of 100 and 200 and you think of some of the organisations and some of the events that you might have visited in churches, in parish halls, I used to be a scout leader, and I know the paperwork and the burden and the challenges used to put us off in many ways fulfilling some of those functions, and the people who might have come along to help one day then get slightly put off by the challenges that come with it and the responsibilities that come with it. So I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend. Yeah.
He has responded in that way to his colleague. Is he not welcoming the fact that this bill increases the capacity from 100 to 200, and it was your government, or sorry, their government previously, that set that limit at 100, about which you're so concerned?
The revisions, that's why we have the scrutiny, and in fact when we look in there we're discussing the fact that you can unilaterally determine those figures is the concern. I think across the House is agreement that this is the right thing to do to take it forwards. I think we're looking around the edges at what we can do to mitigate some of that for some of these small venues, but I agree in principle with that. Yeah. With the honourable member,
yep. One more time. I'm very grateful for the honourable member giving way one more time. I'm particularly concerned about new clause 25, which deals with the power, giving power to the Secretary of State or the Minister to by regulation, reduce the number from 200 back to 100. Does he agree with me that without very significant evidence to support or consultation to support such a move as that, it is essentially an arbitrary number? Why 100? Why not 125, 150 or 175? So does he agree with me that we need more evidence to support that regulation power giving to the Secretary of State, and as a result, new clause 25 is a very sensible alternative?
I agree entirely. I don't think there's any reason that we shouldn't be able to bring that back. I don't think there's any reason we need to delegate to the Secretary of State on that. I think it's a very sensible thing to take that delegation out. We've just had the discussion across the bench there that actually some people think 100, some people think 200. It's a logical thing to do to bring that back to the House should it be required in due course, and hopefully he'll agree. Yeah.
To my honourable friend for giving way, and I just want to add to the points that have been made. We all hope that this bill is absolutely right. That's what we want it to be. But there is nothing wrong with increased scrutiny and more scrutiny, and therefore wouldn't it be right for the government to accept this amendment so that we can make sure that there is a review process to ensure that when we have the evidence, we know we've got it right.
I think that's entirely right. I think most of these bills do look around the edges of the bill and what we can do to mitigate some of the challenges for small community organisations and small businesses. I would happily give.
I just want to say that, Madam Deputy Speaker, that on this point we have to be very, very careful. Of course we want to work on a cross-party basis. Of course we have to be cognisant of small business. But on the other side of the debate, the campaigners are very, very worried that this bill has already been leaning too much the other way, and we start to lose proportionality if we start to adopt the amendments the Honourable Member is proposing.
I would slightly disagree in that I think the idea of the body, of a pre-existing body, taking on the regulation of this situation is something that can sensibly be reviewed in 18 months to see if it's working. I think the idea that we keep the ability to make decisions around numbers here rather than with the Secretary of State is a logical way forwards. We all want to see this work. We all realise the really meaningful and important reasons that this bill's being brought forwards. But it is about that mitigation. It is about putting things in place. And I think all of these amendments are fair, logical and sound in that they try to balance the two interests. I think the reality is we want to make all of these venues safe, whatever the scale and whatever the size, but we need to do it in a way that allows these businesses and community organisations to carry on in business and delivering at the heart of our communities. Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Last week I met with, along with some opposition colleagues, with a number of hospitality businesses from across different sectors. Everyone wanted to make their venue more secure, and everyone acknowledged the importance of this legislation. But on the points of clarity and the uncertainty that's being caused, it's been talked about in terms of responsibilities of volunteers and where the responsibility starts and ends. And some of those venues, of course, will have queues outside. It's not quite clear how that interaction will work, which is why that 18-month period is quite important, because it will allow us to have a look at that legislation and see if it's actually making people more safe or more secure. Does he agree with me?
Right, when the stakes are very high for some of these community organisations, for some of these small businesses of bringing this forwards, I don't see any harm in reviewing it after 8 months how that's being regulated. I don't see any harm in keeping those powers with the House rather than delegating them to the Secretary of State. I think it's logical. I think it makes a lot of sense for many venues, and it's the way forwards.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Member for giving way one more time. If you look at Clause 2, subparagraph 2c, it says when defining the kind of premises that will be covered by this, it says it's reasonable to expect that from time to time 200 or more individuals may be present, or under these regulations that might read 100 or more may be present. Coming back to my experience as a member of the parish church, I would love there to be 100 or 200 people present in my church. The congregation is closer to 6 or 7 rather than 100 or 200. However, the capacity of the church, the structure, is sufficient to take in 200 or 100 people. So does my honourable friend share my concern that whilst on the face of it, it seems reasonable that a facility that could welcome 199 people may not have the structures in place, may not physically have the people available to support the increased burden that the legislation might require under the regulations, which would be dealt with by new clause 25, and that, it, again, increases the risk of unintended consequences of closure.
I think you're entirely right. I think when we talk about from time to time, if you have such an organisation, such a voluntary organisation made up of men and women from across the piece who tend to be doing something else by day and doing that by weekend or evening, or tend to have had some other things going on in their life, the time that they commit means they're not necessarily going to be an expert in the laws surrounding venues and what goes on there. And if it's from time to time, that means once in a year, once in every 2 years, they're expected to know about this and be able to comply with it. So I think there's a logic in keeping it at the intended 200. I think there's a logic in reviewing how it's regulated and following those lines. And should it, you know, all of these things, we're allowing the regulatory body to come back in 18 months to be reviewed. We're allowing those numbers to come back and be reviewed, but we're just saying we shouldn't delegate them to the Secretary of State at this point.
The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. Minister Dan Jarvis. I call Tim Roca.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the progress of this important bill. We know the danger that terrorism places on this country and the residents that we represent, the constituents that we represent. 15 domestic terror plots, attacks, I should say, since 2017, and that tragic arena bombing excluding terrorism in Northern Ireland. 43 late-stage plots filled by the security services, and we heard from the head of the security service recently about the 48% increase in terror investigations in the last year alone. So the threat is absolutely real, and the threat is always changing as well. We've seen various kinds of attacks, ranging all the way through to the marauding-style terrorist attacks that we saw so tragically here in London some years ago. And this bill is a crucial part of making sure that premises are doing what they can, and that businesses are doing what they can, and venues are doing what they can to make sure people are safe. And we know from businesses and we know from venues that they want to do that. They understand that they have an obligation to their patrons, their visitors, their customers, whoever it might be. And we've had a healthy debate about the provisions of this bill. There's been a sensible, mature, cross-party discussion about what works and what is practicable. And I want to pay tribute to Manchester City Council, actually, for the exercises they did, working with businesses to make sure that measures were both sensible, proportionate, but also kept people safe. Across 10 different sessions, I think it was last year, speaking to 700 businesses and 2,000 people, they went through some of the measures that we see in this bill today, and businesses overwhelmingly supported them. They understood the need for them, and they understood that they were not onerous. And these were businesses as large as the Printworks, that many people in Manchester will know, down to local restaurants and bars. And the response was incredibly positive. And I say that because I want to reassure members across the House about the proportionality of the measures proposed in this bill. In fact, if I can quote Gareth Worthington, the nighttime economy officer at the Manchester Business Improvement District, he said, "If a venue operator does not know how to evacuate their venue, they should not be running that venue, and if training can be provided to help that make that evacuation safer, then venues should grasp it with both hands." I think we've arrived at a sensible place in terms of the thresholds involved. We had a healthy debate at the Public Bill Committee on them, and I think they are reasonable. I'll reiterate what I said before, which is I think campaigners will feel any tweaking of the provisions to do with the thresholds or delegated powers to the Secretary of State would be perceived as a watering down of the bill, to be honest. And finally, I shan't give way, because I think we've touched on that point enough. And then finally, I want to pay tribute to my constituent, Fegan Murray, for her bravery in championing these measures. No parent would ever want to have the name of their child on a law if they could help it. But she has worked tirelessly to push forward these measures, and I hope to see them enacted, and I recommend the bill and thank the Minister for his hard work on it.
Yeah. I call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd echo the comments from the Honourable Member for Macclesfield that this has been a constructive, cross-party piece of legislation. I also pay tribute to the Security Minister for the way in which he's engaged myself and my Liberal Democrat colleagues on a cross-party basis. And in that spirit, I'd like to offer my comments on the bill. The purpose of this bill and the amendment that we Liberal Democrats have tabled, New Clause 2, is clear. I'm pleased the House has been given the opportunity to champion the family of Martin and Martin's family's campaign. This bill draws clear lessons from the tragic 2017 attack and brings fresh commitments to protect lives. Martin's Law embodies the courage and determination of the families of the victims, who have campaigned tirelessly to ensure lessons are learned and tragedies like this one are prevented in the future. I'd also like to echo the comments made by the Shadow Minister about Fegan Murray, whom I pay great tribute to, hugely inspirational campaigner. Their voices have been instrumental in shaping this legislation throughout the legislative process. It's down to their resilience, and we as legislators have a duty to honour their efforts by ensuring that this bill is as robust and effective as possible, while at the same time ensuring no excessive burden is put on our already struggling businesses. As with all considerations of this House, we must remain balanced in our approach, and we must carefully weigh up the safety of event-goers with pragmatic and realistic requirements. While the bill is strong, it lacks the proper provisions to ensure that staff at venues, especially smaller ones that may be on the cusp of the thresholds, are adequately equipped and trained to respond to threats. And that's where our amendment, New Clause 2, comes in. Madam Deputy Speaker, consider just a few of the smaller venues in my North Cornwall constituency, such as the St Kew Inn, St Petrock's Church, Hayward Cider Farm, the Beat in Bodmin, the Old Inn, countless others. These places host ticketed events, and some are likely to fall very close to the 200 threshold. Others may even fall close to the upper 800 threshold and be considered an enhanced duty premises. Yet many of the smaller venues are run by volunteers or communities with little or no formal training in event management or public protection procedures. Our amendment addresses this issue directly. It ensures all venue staff and volunteers, whether they work in a pub, a church hall or a farm shop, are equipped with the right training to prepare them to keep the public safe.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
And on that very point, does he not think that those volunteers in church halls and other small venues will not be put off by the thought of having to go through a training course, to implement a training plan and all those other aspects within New Clause 2? And while those may be worthy objectives for larger venues, does he really think that that is desirable for small venues? And does he not perceive the risk that it will put off volunteers that would have otherwise freely give of their time?
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I would say to him that I've spoken to many venues across my constituency this weekend, and actually they're more put off by the ambiguity in the bill and the lack of the specifics that they'll be required to undertake. So the reason behind New Clause 2 is to give them that clarity and to make sure they know exactly what's required of them under the bill. I will give way.
And I think particularly it is this volunteer side that I think is concerning a lot of people. One thing that strikes me about the New Clause 2, though, is with this training, given that they are often volunteer organisations, who is likely to fund this? Is there a thought behind who's going to pay for this, how much it would cost? Because small organisations like My Village Halls will struggle to make a couple of £100 potentially for the year, let alone to then have to be able to afford further training. I wonder if he'd enlighten me on how that may work.
Thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and I suspect that's possibly a question for the Minister when we come towards the end of this debate, but it's certainly something that I think volunteers will be seeking clarity on so that they know exactly what's required of them under this bill. And without the adequate training, we end up with just vague asks of them that they don't know exactly how they carry out this legislation. So,
will you give way on that point?
I will give way.
And with due respect, I note that he mentioned that that's a question for the Minister, the cost, etc. Since this is the members' new clause, surely there's an obligation on the proposer of the clause to have some idea of what the implications, financial and otherwise, are for the organisations which would have to comply with it.
I thank again the honourable member for that intervention, and I certainly wouldn't suggest, and I don't think the Liberal Democrats would suggest, that this training fee would fall on these small venues, but it's certainly something that the government should consider so that there is clarity for those smaller venues. I hope that answers the member's question. I'm going to make just some progress and I'll let you in later. It covers evacuation procedures, the monitoring of premises, physical safety and security, and the overall provision of protecting lives. This amendment would also establish a full training implementation plan with regular updates from the Secretary of State to Parliament to ensure that the right progress is being made, and ensuring, crucially, that our businesses are fully supported and given the clarity that they need. The public deserve to know that wherever they are, at a concert, a wedding or a local cider festival, staff are properly trained to respond to such emergencies. They should have confidence that venues are held to a consistent standard of preparation and readiness, and for the venues themselves, our amendment will greatly improve the safety and also provide clarity and consistency in standards they must meet under this law. But there are, of course, concerns from many micro and small businesses about the financial impact and the additional bureaucracy that these requirements may bring. That's why this amendment proposes a practical training plan which minimises the financial burden with scalable and specific training. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way, and I've already mentioned that I'm a church warden, and so I have practical experience. As a church warden of a small parish church, you have other duties. I'm also the safeguarding officer, because there are insufficient volunteers who are prepared to undergo the quite significant training that you need in order to maintain safeguarding duties in that organisation. And I accept, particularly for the Church of England and our troubled history over the last 20 years, that safeguarding is a necessary part of modern life. But does he accept that these duties that you impose on volunteers are cumulative in their impact? And whilst I can be a Member of Parliament and be a church warden and be the safeguarding officer, can I also be responsible for the additional costs and responsibilities that he has in mind?
Thank the honourable member again for that intervention. And certainly the intention of New Clause 2 is not to be a burden on our small venues. It's actually to do the opposite and make sure that they have clarity on what they're supposed to do under this bill, what their responsibilities are, how they practically carry out the requirements that are contained in this legislation. I'm just going to make a little bit more progress. During this time, venues will have, during the I was glad to receive the promising indication of commitment in writing by the Security Minister, who said that if this bill is given royal assent, an implementation period of 24 months will be given. During this time, venues will have the time to understand their new obligations, plan and prepare as necessary, and if needed, they will provide training to staff. This will be supplied by working with what the government promises, a number of expert security partners. I look forward to hearing more details on this. Over the weekend, I met with various local venues in my North Cornwall constituency, such as the Seaview Farm Shop, who specifically expressed concerns over possible fencing requirements. Their venue hosts small outdoor festivals with between 1,500 and 2,000 attendees. It's similar in scale to the nearby Rock Oyster Festival, and can be contrasted with much larger events such as Boardmasters, which hosts over 60,000 people. And I would ask the Minister to provide clarity on some of these requirements for outdoor events. While we're not seeking to push this amendment through, we will also be seeking reassurances from the Minister today about the training for staff and operators for venues big and small. I note the new Clause 1 amendment today tabled by the Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, which proposes a review of the role of the Security Industry Authority as the regulator. While we don't oppose a cost-benefit analysis of the role of the SIA, we do worry about the impact of additional responsibility on our already stretched to breaking point local government without the accompanying resources to deliver. While I welcome the intent to ensure efficiency and effectiveness, I must stress the need for reassurances that smaller venues, like the village halls we've heard about, like the community centres, as the Honourable Member was saying, are often run by volunteers, will not be disproportionately impacted. In North Cornwall, for example, we have venues such as the Betjeman Centre in Weybridge, village halls in Padstow, Onyx, St Mabon, and many more. And in regards to Amendments 25 and 26, I acknowledge the additional proposed amendments to raise the minimum capacity thresholds for standard and enhanced duty premises to 200 and 800 respectively. These spaces are integral to our communities, yet they operate with limited resources, often run by volunteers, and cannot shoulder excessive regulatory burdens. Any changes must prioritise support and scalability for these organisations so they are equipped to meet public protection requirements without being overwhelmed. This legislation will not be able to do that if it's too burdensome for businesses who are not clear on what their obligations really are. I'd ask the Minister to confirm that the content of our amendment will be given due consideration. Keeping everyone safe is clearly the absolute priority, but providing clear guidance and training, we can avoid burdening our already struggling local businesses and ensure that they have the clarity that they crucially need over these regulations. Thank you.
I call Matt Bishop.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by expressing my own admiration to Fegan Murray for her unwavering advocacy of this bill in memory of her son Martin. Her defiant message to promote peace and positive change in Martin's name has been a source of inspiration to all of us. Fegan's strength and dedication in pushing for meaningful reforms to prevent such devastating attacks in the future is truly commendable. Her courage and commitment continue to drive this important work, and we are deeply grateful for her contributions. Now, as a former police officer myself, I believe this legislation represents an important step forward in improving our national security framework and in providing our communities with greater protection from the evolving threat of terrorism. The bill is needed as the level of threat remains complex, evolving and enduring. By implementing stronger security measures, providing clearer responsibilities for venue owners and enhancing coordination between relevant agencies, this legislation will help safeguard the public in places where they gather, work and celebrate. In an increasingly unpredictable world, it is vital that we remain proactive in protecting our communities and strengthening the resilience of our society. This bill is a crucial part of that effort. By designating a person responsible for considering the risks and planning a response in the event of a terrorist attack, we're taking a proactive and structured approach to security. The role is not only about managing immediate responses, but also about fostering a culture of vigilance, communication and preparedness. And that's within communities and organisations in general. In doing so, legislation will ensure our response is effective as possible. I will give way.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for making an excellent speech and for his own service in the police. I had 3 victims in Manchester Arena bombing: Sorrel Lakowski, Courtney Boyle and Wendy Fall. And that is why I'm so very supportive of this bill. But he's talking about the duties of venues and the managers of venues. Would he agree with me that it would be really helpful for the government to give very clear guidance around their responsibilities for outdoor and public spaces when managing the particular regulatory framework this bill will create?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree that that is a very important part of this bill and legislation moving forward. Yes, I will give way. Thank you.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and it's been striking in the debate so far that we've been talking about the extent of the cross-party consensus on this matter. One of my worries is that this bill has a set of proposals that we might be supporting because there's something that we deem sort of possible to do, whereas some of the things that are harder to do we may be neglecting. In the inquiry into the bombing, there were several aspects of the story that were very concerning, from the way the asylum system worked through to the PREVENT programme. The latest data shows that the number of PREVENT referrals for young people suspected of Islamist radicalisation have fallen from 3,706 in 16-17 to only 781 in 22-23, while 90% of MI5's counter-terrorism casework is Islamist. As a former police officer, would the honourable gentleman agree with me that we've got to do something to make sure that the PREVENT programme is properly targeted at the real threats we face?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention and wholeheartedly agree. Anything to support PREVENT training and in schools and education is very important. I wholeheartedly agree. So in doing so with this legislation, this will ensure that our response is as effective as possible. It will minimise the risks to lives and infrastructure. It's essential that everyone, from leadership to staff members, understand the importance of this role and supports the planning and implementation of all safety protocols. The bill is not just about securing physical spaces, though. It's about fostering a sense of security and trust in the places we work, gather and celebrate. In a time when the threat of terrorism can cause widespread fear and uncertainty, knowing that protective measures are in place allows people to go about their daily lives with greater confidence. It's about protecting not just our buildings, but the social fabric that holds our communities together. Being a member of the Bill Committee has been insightful. It was an opportunity to closely examine the provisions of this important legislation and engage in constructive discussion with my colleagues, other stakeholders and those sadly affected by terrorism. In the committee hearings, I was pleased to hear that various businesses and venues are already implementing the standards of the bill in their operations. It's intended to ensure that public premises and events are better prepared for if the unthinkable happens, and they are ready to respond. The preemptive response to the bill highlights the commitment of many organisations to the safety and security of the public and the recognition of the importance of proactive measures in the face of potential threats. It demonstrates a shared understanding that protecting people from harm is not just the responsibility of government, but of everybody in our sector, in our society. The bill seeks to formalise and build upon these efforts, ensuring that security practices are consistent, comprehensive and capable of meeting the evolving nature of the terrorist threat. I do acknowledge the concerns raised during the debate and the committee's work, which I believe have been addressed, to make the bill more effective, fair and responsive to the challenges at hand. As we move forward, it's crucial to remember that this is a shared responsibility. As stated, the government cannot act alone. I will give way.
Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to just make a short intervention. He talks about shared responsibility and how it's all our responsibility to protect each other. As a former police officer, are you not worried about a degree of vigilantism at this point? Untrained people taking the law into their own hands, doing things that perhaps as a police officer you think police officers would be best placed to do?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I think it's a fair intervention and fair point, but I'm not worried that this bill will cause that. I think the general wider public will allow the police to deal with the matters in hand when they need to. But they may, as I mentioned, in several opportunities to act upon this together. So as we said, public venues, businesses, local authorities and the communities themselves must all work in tandem to create a robust, unified front against terrorism. By integrating efforts across sectors, we make our society stronger and more resilient, able to respond more effectively to threats, whilst ensuring the safety of every individual. Terrorism is not a static threat. It constantly evolves, and so must our response. The bill ensures that we remain ahead of emerging risks and as we've seen in recent years, attacks are becoming more unpredictable, more dispersed and harder to anticipate. This legislation gives us the tools and framework needed to adapt and respond to those ever-changing threats. The legislation is more than about policy. It's about the future we want to build for our children, our families and our communities. We owe it to the future generations to ensure that they inherit a society that values safety, peace and resilience. And by taking action now, we lay the foundation for a stronger, safer tomorrow.
Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you very much for your indulgence as I had to nip upstairs to be on a Bill Committee programming session, but I'm delighted to be here to speak on this piece of legislation. And as I mentioned earlier to the Shadow Minister, I had the privilege of working alongside the Minister as the Shadow Home Affairs Minister that took this through at second reading. And can I say again to the Minister and to the Home Secretary, the Minister knows I'm a big fan of his, but that's for genuine purposes, in that the way in which he treated me as the Shadow Home Affairs Minister at the time, through informal consultations, phone calls, and genuinely opening up the spirit of cross-party working on this legislation. I'd like to congratulate him and pay tribute to him and his department and all officials in this for making sure that we were involved, and I am very pleased that he's in his place this evening to be able to thank him for that spirit of cooperation. And Madam Deputy Speaker, well, we know that this piece of legislation was a key piece of legislation and a commitment that the Conservatives made at the last general election. And I am, as I say, delighted that the government has taken this forward. As the Minister will know, I did have some concerns in my winding up at second reading that I just want to challenge, just to chase him on, if he might be so bold as to try and answer them at the end of the session. But there are a number of concerns that I have that I will briefly, you'd be delighted to hear, Madam Deputy Speaker, like to speak about. Can't promise too brief, but I'll be as brief as I possibly can. And of course, and you have to excuse me if I'm out of breath, because I did run upstairs and run back downstairs to get here in time, and I'm not the fittest person in the chamber. Never. But I would, of course, like to pay tribute to Fegan Murray and the family of Martin. I said in the second reading that it shouldn't be circumstances like the ones that we have seen shouldn't happen to be able to bring in a change in legislation or a change in the law. But Fegan Murray can rest assured that Martin played a huge role in changing the law for the good of the circumstances that we see going forward, and they have a right to be proud of that legacy that they have left. I rise to speak in favour of new Clause 1 and Amendment 25 and 27 in the name of my honourable friend. And as I said at the beginning, all of us support the aims and the aims of this bill, and we want to see this legislation succeed. We want to make sure that our venues across the country are safer, that they have the correct apparatus in place to make sure that people who use venues, hospitality venues or venues across the country of all shapes and sizes, that they can use them having confidence that there is a system in place and a regulatory framework in place to make sure that they are safer and that people are safe when they use them. My constituents expect that. I expect that on behalf of myself. I expect that on behalf of my family, who just last night we used a hospitality venue for a good couple of pints. And we will know that that will be one that will be one that will be included within this regulatory framework. And sitting there, it made me think, looking at the forward ahead agenda within Parliament, that actually there are a number of concerns that venues like that have, and there are some of the things I just want to talk about this evening. Because if we think in our constituencies, we have voluntary sector organisations, theatre groups, we have community centres, we have charities of all shapes and sizes who volunteer every day to make sure that they are doing the best by their community and that they are representing the community and working for the community in the best way possible. And I remain concerned that the smaller venues, has been outlined by a number of honourable friends on this side of the House and the Shadow Minister, that there remains an undue burden that will be placed on those organisations because of some of the other, how do I put it, because I don't want the speech to be political at all, but environmental factors that have been placed on them in recent months. We know...
The Honourable Man.
Of course, yes.
Can he speak to a moment to the situation facing small football clubs, who often have many people turning up week after week to watch their team play, who are on a tiny budget, with tiny margins, with no money to spare, no money available for training. In these circumstances, surely those ones are going to be really hard done by some of the provisions in this bill.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely correct. You know, my constituency has a number of small football organisations. I know some of that is subject to legislation that's currently going through the Lords in a slower way than we would necessarily expect on a piece of legislation, and that will be the focus of that piece of legislation when it comes to the income of small football groups. But he's right, that it doesn't just cover small football venues and football clubs. It covers all sorts of organisations, some of which I've already mentioned. But if we look at, for example, small community theatres are the backbone of many small communities, people that want to go with their family and watch amateur dramatics plays, sometimes better than the West End, I've seen them, who have venues of the scale that are allocated within the lower tier of the bill, but have very, very small incomes, and charities that have very, very small incomes that have been affected by some of the fiscal decisions that have happened in the last budget. And I assure the Minister I am not being political, but the impact assessments on people that I have spoken to in my constituency, many charities, are affected with an increase in costs through national insurance contributions, through different taxation that will be coming in. And this, on average, from what I've read, on the smaller venues will cost around £330 per year. Now, the larger organisations, that will cost £5,000 per year, but the latest figures that I could find, so perhaps the Minister could clarify, is that on smaller venues there will be an additional cost of around £330 per year. And to many organisations, that is a big element of burden that will be placed on them during the year. And there is one sector that I would just like to ask the Minister to comment on. I've met theatres recently, very small theatres, who were concerned that they have not been invited to a round table with the Minister to discuss some of the implications on that sector. I'd be grateful to him if he would be able to just outline whether the government intends to meet them based around their concerns on this bill. The Minister, and I'm bringing my comments within scope of new clause 1, it is because of the issues that I've outlined that I think that my honourable friend's amendment in terms of new clause 1 to have a reviewing process of the SIA is perfectly sensible. It seems to me that when we are setting up a new organisation to have some kind of independence or regulatory enforcement capacity or management capacity, that it seems purely sensible to me that after the set period within the new clause that we would have to look to see whether that has been proportionate, whether there hasn't been overreach, whether actually they're doing their job properly because they're not having the responsibilities or taking those full responsibilities outlined within the legislation. It may not be that members of this House will look at them as overworking. It may be that they're underworking and we need to put more responsibilities on them in the long run. But it does seem perfectly sensible to me that the government should come to the floor of the House, or the Minister should come to the dispatch box and see this new clause in the spirit in which it is intended, in that the front bench of the opposition, myself and all of my colleagues sitting around me want this piece of legislation to succeed, but we want it to be a proportionate piece of legislation that when we are setting up an organisation that has responsibilities and organisational jurisdiction, that they are reviewed and that we make sure that they are conducting their responsibilities seriously and taking those responsibilities seriously enough, and that the system is working. I'll give way, yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that the provision new clause 1, it's not there as a presumption of finding fault, it's just to ensure that this is actually working correctly, because it's so important that the regulator's role is working perfectly so this bill can be implemented in the ways it's expected to?
I don't think it comes as a surprise, because I always agree with my honourable friend, because she is a reasonable and a very good colleague in the way in which she comes to her duties in this House. I absolutely agree with her, and I do say that about some members opposite as well, so I'm not being partisan, but I do think that she, most of the time, I do think that she's making a good point, and I think that's why I say to the Minister that he should see that, as I said, new clause 1 is laid in the spirit in which it is intended. We do not want to disrupt the passage of this bill. We do not want to disrupt the good intentions and the outcomes that everybody on that side of the House, on other sides of the House, has said that we want to work. But we do see that when, as a Conservative, I naturally think that the state shouldn't be big or oversized, that when we set up organisations like this, that it is natural that this House and members will want to have scrutiny functions to make sure that they are acting within the spirit of the law, they're acting within their jurisdiction and their responsibilities, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Give way on that point?
I will give way.
I think for me, when it turns to looking at this and creating the regulator responsible, it's making sure we have an effective regulator, because that needs to be staffed and funded, and making sure that it's doing the job we expect it, this House expects it to do. So when we're providing those provisions in this bill, I think it is important to be having a reporting system back. I wonder if he's given any thought when he was Shadow Minister about how many businesses actually come in scope, and if there are other resources there within the regulator to even provide those provisions to make those assessments and make sure they're held accountable to ensure that this is effective legislation.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I would like to say that yes, I'd given it great thought, but I think members across the House will know that when we came back after July, my tenure as a Shadow Home Affairs Minister was rather short, after also being Shadow Northern... Thank you to the Minister who says shame. After being Shadow Northern Ireland Minister, Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister and many other ministers too. But I did take this piece of legislation seriously. And look, that's a decision for the government that they should be making. But I would hope that the SIA is properly resourced and that they conduct their duties in the right way. And as I say, that's very much why I think News Clause 1 should come before the House, should be voted through this evening. Very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I don't want to overstay my welcome. I just want to speak very quickly about one of the concerns that I raised at second reading, and that is the piece of the bill that discusses the responsible person element of the bill. I remain seriously concerned, and I know that my honourable friend in his intervention, member for Bridgewater, brought this up, that while accepting the scope of the bill and the impacts that this will have on the statute book, there are many organisations, particularly during cost of living crises and particularly at this time of year, who rely on their volunteers, who, if we place undue and burdensome regulations on them, just simply won't come forward and be in the voluntary sector. We know that charities are going through a difficult time at the moment. And if, as I remain concerned, we just tip slightly too much into being overburdensome on those very small organisations, then we will see the dearth of the voluntary sector. And no one, I know the Minister doesn't, I know the Shadow Minister doesn't, and we don't want to discourage people from volunteering. And I do worry, I really worry that this will be an unintended consequence on the thresholds currently set out within the provisions of the legislation. So I ask him to look very seriously, not only at New Clause 1, because I've done that, but Amendment 25 and 27, which have been laid in the name of... 26, forgive me, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Rutland and Stamford. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I say, many people will be happy to know that I'm drawing my comments to a close, but I just want to outline again that I am personally delighted to see that this legislation is before the House in such record time after 5 months of the government coming to office. And I hope the Minister will see that we on this side are working and will continue to work in a constructive way to get this piece of legislation onto the statute book. As I said at the beginning, it is a sad occasion that in order to have a relatively major piece of legislation changed in such a quick, rapid succession, that we had to go through the atrocities that we saw in Manchester and terrorist attacks around the whole of the United Kingdom. But I know that the legacy that Martin leaves is one that his family should be greatly proud of, and that this country in many years to come should also be greatly proud of, because this is a mainstream piece of legislation. It is a major piece of legislation that I hope, working together, would ensure that people who go to venues across this country for many years to come are protected, and they're protected in Martin's name. Thank you very much.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think I'd like to begin by welcoming the fact that the discussion in the House today shows real cross-party support for the aims and the principles and the objectives of this legislation, and that the amendments really focus only on nuances and more technical aspects, because it shows that we're all united in trying to achieve the aims of the goal and prevent tragedies like that happened in Manchester from happening again. And I think in trying to understand where those nuances and more technical sides should be drawn, it's useful to reflect on what the key advantages of this and key dimensions of this legislation are. So firstly, obviously, it's that it makes terrorist attacks more likely. The terrorist threat is substantial, and we know that the terror threat is changing. It's gone from large-scale infrastructure and iconic sites to much more workaday, normal locations. The most recent terrorist attack we tragically saw in this country was in a children's dance class, and we can see that the terror threat is evolving, and so we must evolve with it, and that's why this legislation is important. But it's also important because it minimises the death and destruction that takes place in the event of a terrorist attack happening. Terrorist attacks may still happen despite our best efforts, and it's important that we plan for that situation and make the right decisions to be ready when it does. Obama's Undersecretary of State for Homeland Security, the Harvard professor Juliet Kayyem, talks about the boom of a terror moment or a crisis and divides planning into pre-boom and post-boom. Pre-boom is what you do to stop an event happening, but it is equally important to plan for the post-boom moment. We need to make sure that even small venues have done some thinking in advance of an attack, what the escape routes are, who needs to have the keys, what do you do if you direct people in that direction versus this direction. And that's why this legislation, incorporating a distinction between enhanced and non-enhanced tiers, is really important. I think of my own constituency in Edinburgh East and Musselburgh. We put on some of the biggest and best events in the world. I'm utterly confident that the football stadiums and rugby stadiums and theatres who have security planning do all this thinking anyway. But there are many smaller venues who haven't thought that this is necessarily their role to do that, but they are now in the line of fire of terrorists. And so it's important that they recognise that responsibility, because the public has a right to expect it, and this legislation codifies what should be happening anyway. And that's why it's important that we bear that in mind as we decide where to set the thresholds and who falls in or outside scope, and what level of burden we expect those organisations and venues to face. During the passage of this bill through committee stage, it was really reassuring to hear several of my concerns or questions being allayed. One of those is what's already been discussed, which is the impact on business and the potential for a burden. Now, there's no denying that there is something of a burden that will be placed on some organisations who haven't done any thinking or preparation for the potential for a terrorist or other kind of attack. But the legislation sets out very proportionate elements that are very little of an extra burden. The requirements that ask of them are intuitive, they're not onerous, they're straightforward, and they're commonsensical. As I said in my intervention earlier, they're essentially prompts for organisations to do the kind of thinking we really would hope they were doing already to avoid an attack. And that has the effect of avoiding attacks, but also, as I say, mitigating the impact of attacks. And yes, I'll give way.
I agree entirely, Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree entirely with my friend in terms of the proportionality of this bill that we discussed at committee stage. And we've heard a lot about the word burden has been used this afternoon in this debate. But I just want to go back, if I may, to the evidence that Andy Burnham gave to committee at committee stage, where he said, I just think that we cannot talk ourselves into a sort of thing where it is all too big a burden. I can tell you from experience, a terrorist attack is a massive burden on a city, and what it does challenge everybody at every level, and that is ongoing. He referred to Fegan. Like Fegan said, Manchester will never be the same again after what happened. It has changed us, but it has strengthened us and made us more united. And as I say, I do not want any other city to go through that. Would my friend agree that this is a proportionate bill and that the burden of a terrorist attack by far outweighs the provisions that are being put forward today?
Absolutely. So I thank my honourable friend for her intervention because she makes absolutely the correct point. There is a small element of burden here, but it is light touch and proportionate, and the alternative scenario is a significantly more burdensome one. I think of my own city of Edinburgh. The impact of a terrorist attack and people not feeling secure in the aftermath of that could be destructive, not just for the lives affected by that attack, but for the whole economy our city is based on, which is event-focused. It's totally correct that we draw that distinction and seek to get the balance in exactly the right place. Yes, I'll go, please.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's giving an eloquent speech about the protect element of the counter-terrorism strategy. When you read the Manchester attack inquiry report, it's very clear that the asylum system is a big part of the story. Salman Abedi and his brother Hashim, who planned the attack and prepared the explosives and was as guilty of the attackers, Salman, were born in Britain to Libyan asylum seeker parents. Their father, Ramadan Abedi, was a member of the Libyan Islamic fighting group, which was an Islamist militia in Libya. He was granted asylum in this country, but travelled back and forth between Britain and Libya through that whole time, which is actually a common story that we hear often with people who are granted asylum in this country. Given the numbers of people coming to this country illegally and across the Channel, about whom we have no ability to investigate and make checks, can he let us know what his view is of how we might reform the asylum system to prevent this kind of thing happening again?
Thank you to the honourable gentleman for making that intervention. I think that I'm struggling to see quite how that falls within the scope of this debate. There are many. It's an important issue to deal with how we tackle terrorism. As we have seen in the history of this country, terrorist attacks can be foreign and domestic. They can be homegrown. They can come from overseas. But I made the distinction of how to prepare for an attack before it happens, so there's mitigations you can put in place. Those can be very, very long term in terms of looking at where the threat is emanating from. They can be in the immediate advance of an attack, such as the security considerations you put in place. But my argument here actually is that the benefit of this bill is what happens after the attack has taken place. It is in those smaller venues that now find themselves in scope of terrorist attacks, how we help them prepare for it, regardless actually of who committed the offence, but how they are prepared to deal with that event. Yes.
Very grateful to the member giving way. I was fortunate enough to listen to his Westminster Hall debate on the Fringe, the Edinburgh Fringe, and how it's a success around the world. This is a prime example of where this legislation might come in and actually help support it. I wonder if he's given some thought of those small venues and how they can work together, because it can create an environment of security if they are sharing best practice. I wonder if the Fringe have done any thoughts about how that might be the case, given they are likely to be a target by the very nature of who they are. And sharing best practice amongst those small venues could actually help strengthen the entire environment people go and visit.
Thank you. So I thank the honourable member for his intervention, slightly more in scope and also about Edinburgh, so I'm more happy to take it. He's absolutely right, and actually in advance of the Bill Committee and of this debate today, I spoke to Edinburgh City Council and to some of the event organisers, and what they told me is it's exactly because Edinburgh has become the place that does this on a regular basis, that it's more normalised for us in our city, that we actually have quite a lot of the infrastructure in place and the thinking and the organisational requirements, the corporate memory between small venues to cope with these kind of events. Edinburgh is actually seen, as Andy Burnham pointed out in his evidence, as one of the national leaders on this front. But I'm aware that not everyone's community has that advantage, and that's why this legislation will extend to your communities, what I believe mine already benefits from, because we already have a lot of these structures in place. And of course, Edinburgh is going to be very happy to help you in setting that up. One final intervention, yes.
The member made a comment just before the last intervention that these were prompts, and really it was to talk about what happened after the event. The worrying thing actually is that the legislation goes beyond that, because legislation talks about where it is it's suspected there might be a terrorist event or it's taking place. And this is not about after. While that is happening, there is an obligation in the legislation for the individuals who are in charge of that event to prevent individuals from entering. So before an event or while an event's happening, there's a security obligation upon some of these small groups to prevent people from entering premises. That's a huge burden. It's not a prompt. It's a huge burden on the organisers.
Well, thanks to the honourable member for that intervention. It is a really important point he's making. Again, my argument is, having been on the Bill Committee, that it's proportionate. But it actually takes me to one of the points I was about to make, which is one of the concerns I had beginning this legislative scrutiny process, which I was reassured on in the evidence session. So my concern was that there might be a member of the, there might be a staff member or an official or somebody who is responsible for compliance with this Act, who in the aftermath of a terrorist attack finds themselves at the eye of the storm. We know how high emotions run. We know the all too human urge to seek someone to blame, even unfairly, in the aftermath of an event. But we heard evidence from council officials and from the kind of people who run events who we brought into scope that actually they didn't consider that a burden for them. They said that for several reasons. Firstly, because they already would find themselves in that situation. This legislation is not the thing that causes that, it's the terrorist attack. Actually, this legislation makes the terrorist attack less likely. Secondly, they're already in the eye of the storm, if you use that turn of phrase, they're already in the eye of the storm for other reasons, such as fire safety and things like that, or crowd control. And thirdly, they said that this would be a good piece of legislation for them because not only are they already affected, it equips them to deal with it. This legislation is what equips them in their role as the responsible people. It doesn't create the responsibility, it equips them to deal with it. And that's why it's proportionate and a good piece of legislation to be passing. I'll just very quickly make my final comments because I'm testing everyone's patience. I want to say two final things. This legislation is good in the way that it calculates the capacity of the venue to identify if it falls in scope. It's important about calculating it on actual usage rather than by historic attendance figures. And also I think it's important its incorporation of the reasonably practicable test, which works with venues and premises on their specific circumstances, on their idiosyncrasies. And that's an important component of this legislation, which I think will make sure it works in effect. So in closing, I'm heartened to see that actually across the House we all agree on the objective and the thrust of this bill, and the debate is about a finely balanced nuance of judgments. In the evidence sessions, we heard compelling evidence of its necessity, and we did hear arguments for them to be those thresholds to be set perhaps more loosely. Most evidence suggested more rigidly, more harsh, more strictly. And I'm pleased to see the government had attempted to draw a coherent distinction in the different parts, in the different arguments that we heard. The true success of this legislation will be if we never hear about it again. Sadly, it is too late for the victims of the Manchester bombing, but we can ensure in passing this legislation and setting the correct thresholds that it will be the last time we have to hear about it. Thank you.
I call Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I thank you for calling me, and I do look forward to other contributions. I suppose we live in a society where terrorist threats are a way of life now, whether we like it or whether we don't. Unfortunately, they are, whether they be lone wolf attacks, whether they be aggression from Russia in relation to poisonings, whether they be terrorist groups from across the world that want to focus upon here, Iranian attacks upon those who support a free Iran, the attacks we have, all focus our attention on where we are. And I just want to say how good it is to see the Minister in this place, and we look forward very much to his comments. I wish to be constructive in my comments. I have a few questions I want to ask Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to ask them in a way, hopefully, that the Minister can give me some reassurance in relation to. And I was just thinking, if we go back to our history of Northern Ireland, where terrorist attacks were the norm for some 30-odd years, and where I declared an interest as I served in the Ulster Defence Regiment for 3 years, and also in the Territorial Army for 11.5 years. The reason why I say that is because that psyche that all my soldiers and part-time colleagues in the Ulster Defence Regiment and the Territorial Army had was a psyche of where did you go when you went out anywhere? Where did you go when you went to a restaurant or a cafe? Why is it that us who were soldiers, or those who were my colleagues, when they went to the restaurant or cafe, they sought out the place in the restaurant and cafe where you could watch everything that was happening. You could see who was coming in, you could see who was going out. You could be aware of your escape route if you had to make a quick time to get out. These were the life that we had. And what we're doing tonight in this debate is we're asking our churches, our charities, our missionary groups, those who run community halls, to consider these things who have no experience. Now, I'm not saying that critically, I'm saying that observationally, because I want them to be aware of it. But that was the life that we lived. And indeed, the Minister, the honourable and gallant member that he is, when he got the call to serve in uniform, he took that call and he answered that call. So we want to put on record our thanks to the Minister for doing that. And it tells you a lot about the Minister and about the psyche that the right honourable member has in relation to where we are. I look back on some of the atrocities, and it reminds me of the Darkley Hall massacre, Madam Deputy Speaker, where the INLA burst in and they just shot all around them and killed a number of people who were attending church, innocent people. What was only for the bravery, I would say, of some of the people on the door. There could probably have been more killed. I think of Tullyvallen, Orange Hall, down near Newry, where the IRA came and killed a number of Orange men, just simply because they were Orange men. But the point I'm making about this contribution tonight, those are the lives that we've faced in the past. Those are the lives in Northern Ireland that we had to deal with. And now we're asking our churches and our charities and all those groups across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to look at better security. We're asking people who have not experienced that. We're asking people who have never considered, is a better way of putting it, never considered any need to do that. But we're doing it for a purpose. Now, we all support this legislation. I support it. I want to put it on record right now. I understand the reasoning for it. I understand when we look at the Manchester atrocity, I don't think any of us weren't absolutely incredibly concerned about what has happened. But that's an example of what we've got to try and stop. Happy to give way, of course, yes.
I completely understand that we are asking people to consider something that they've never experienced or never had to consider. But is that not also what we do with fire regulations?
With great respect to the honourable gentleman, it's not about fire regulations. This is about making sure that nobody dies. It's a different thing. Sorry, I'm being respectful to you, but honestly, it's not about that. It's much more than that. Fire regulations, you check is the extinguisher working? This is making sure that nobody comes in to kill anybody. So it's it's a different scenario, and I respect the honourable gentleman, but I just think we've got to get a better focus on this, and we don't mind. Now, I'm also minded about the community hall where the Reverend Robert Bradford was killed. Community hall. The caretaker was on the door. The IRA came. They killed, they shot the caretaker and they shot the Reverend. And we have his plaque in the back of the chamber. I'm very mindful of his courage and his standing that he took as well. So these are things that we deal with. We're not better than anybody else. These are things that we've faced down the years. So I want to focus, if I can, on churches. Because I spoke on this at the second reading and raised the unfortunate experience of Northern Ireland in these matters, and also the need for churches and places of worship to have a place in plan. And so I made it my business after the last time I spoke on this, to go and talk to my churches and get their thoughts on where they are. They want to do and want to be part of this process, so we want to see how we can help them discover that. I know that a few of the questions have been raised by other honourable members, so I'll restrict remarks briefly to questions raised by churches on their roles and responsibilities. Constructively, Minister, these questions I ask. In relation to new clause 2, which I understand now is not going to be moved tonight, I have spoken to a number of churches and key holders in my constituency, and they have each one told me that in their annual child protection training that they undertake at their own cost, that they include their terrorism plans. These are massive steps for people who may in the past have faced some of these things, but suddenly find themselves thrown into the cauldron of where they are. One church in particular, and I highlight this if I can, please, highlighted they ran a special awareness event after the Southport atrocity in recognition that the church halls, which most of the adults are in, is a different building for the church events. Again, just to understand how the process moved forward. This hyper-awareness is a good thing, as long as it's not driven by fear. So I want to, Madam Deputy Speaker, just focus upon that fear. Now, I think one of the other honourable members who spoke earlier, I think it might have been the member for Eastleigh, referred to the fear that some people experience in relation to this. Because these are things that you don't, when you have a church service, when you have a church meeting, when you have the children in for a meeting, or the elderly people, or a community group meeting, or whatever you have. These are things that you don't normally have to deal with, but now you have to. Because it's important. That's why this legislation is so important. It's why the Minister's bringing it forward. It's why this House will support it in relation to why we're bringing it forward. And we need to ensure that our larger venues and churches have the support to ensure that there is no fear, just a plan of action. Now, you can focus upon the fear and become incredibly worried about what it means, or you can focus upon a plan of action to ensure that what happens, you can stop. And I think that's where I wish to focus. And I give an example of Queen's Hall in Newton Ards, just from my constituency, can hold about 300 people. Now, the events that I've been at are mostly charity events. They're nearly all charity events, by the way, the ones that I would attend there. It'll be charity events or church events or events, fundraising events for missionary organisations, which will galvanise a lot of people and bring them all in. And my other friend, the member for East Antrim, referred to the onus. The onus is on those organisations to do that. Again, being constructive, Minister, as I always try to be in this House, I constructively asked the issue, where will that mean in relation to how they function and focus and look after the people. And can I again ask for clarity on what discussions and training that churches can expect to receive help with to ensure they're compliant with the standard tier expectations. They're not saying they're not going to do it, Madam. They're going to do it because that's what they're asked to do. That's not the issue. I'm just thinking how we can help them, how we help those churches, how we help those charity groups, how we help those people to gain the experience and the observation that they very clearly need to have. Will funding be made available to the charitable sector to provide training and assistance? Will there be a dedicated professional available for churches? A specific issue, if I can ask that, Madam Deputy Speaker, to check that they are compliant and have a fit-for-purpose plan of action. That's my request on behalf of the churches that have asked me. We must remember that churches can be largely self-governing, and those outside of the mainstream, like the Presbyterians, the Anglians, the Methodists, or the Roman Catholic, the smaller churches do not have bodies to break this down for them. They don't have that. So again, I ask for those smaller churches. I attend a smaller church, the Baptist Church, but I'm thinking the Elam Church, the Brethren Halls, of which in my constituency of Strangford we have a great many with a large congregation. Again, I make the point in a constructive fashion, and I ask the Minister, but I know the Minister will give me the answers, not to me but to this House and to everyone here, the queries that have been asked. I'm happy to, yeah.
I'm very grateful for the honourable friend for giving way, and I too have lots of churches, and while I fully support this legislation, I do worry about some of the rural ones, for example, when the Minister might be across several churches, and there is a risk if this isn't compliant, then we will have a fine. And therefore, does that mean that there is a risk that potentially these venues won't be able to open when they're already under stress? I hope that isn't the case, and I hope the Minister can allay some of the fears there. But in reality, the way the legislation is written at the moment, that could be a prospect which would be very damaging for many of the rural churches, particularly, that he may well experience in his
constituency.
The honourable member has made his point very well, and I'm sure the Minister will come back in relation to answering that. It's just to make sure that the churches and the charities and the missionary groups and the community groups that all meet across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland are able to do so, and that every help that is necessary can come through the process to ensure that normal life continues, and I think that's what I'm looking for. And the churches need to ensure that they all know what to do and when. I conclude with this, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Southport stabbings, it took me a long time to be able to say that, because it left horrors in all our minds, every one of us. They have shocked many in the mainland, but in Northern Ireland they've recalled to our memories horrific attacks and the days of having men at our doors during the service, because we did do that. Times have changed, and so too have procedures. But we still have enough trauma to recognise the danger, and I say the churches tell me they want to be equipped. They want to be able to respond. The charity groups have said they want to be equipped, they want to be able to respond. So this legislation calls for us to be equipped, for the churches, for the charities to be equipped. And I'm asking the government, and particularly the Minister, to ensure that there is help and support in case the unthinkable does take place. Thank you.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This legislation is a fitting tribute to Martin Hett and the 21 other lives that were tragically cut short in the 2017 Manchester Arena attack. It's also a testament to the tireless efforts of Martin's mother, who has been raised already this evening, Fegan Murray, who's campaigned with such dignity and determination to ensure no family endures the pain hers has suffered. This bill is about increased resilience as a country. It seeks to make our public spaces safer by requiring premises and events to take proportionate, practical steps to prepare for and mitigate the impact of a terrorist attack. It's about ensuring that if the unthinkable happens, lives are saved and harm is reduced. Madam Deputy Speaker, I speak with personal conviction on this matter. Having served in a counter-terror role, I've seen first-hand the devastating consequences of terrorism and the critical importance of prior preparation that this bill lays out. It is essential that our laws and systems keep pace with an ever-evolving risk.
Extremely grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. He's right to say, of course, that Manchester, in a way, stimulated or catalysed this legislation. It's bigger than that, but no more tragic could it possibly be, as he's described. He's right, too, that what's happening is that terrorists are becoming more adaptable, and so we have to adapt in the way we deal with that. And legislation is part of that. It's difficult because legislation takes a long time to perfect. It's properly scrutinised in this House, and the amendments that are tabled today are an attempt to improve the bill, they're not an attempt to frustrate it. But will you agree with me that in doing so, the Minister and the Government will need to regularly review the provisions of legislation? There's reference in the bill to reviews and guidance and so on, but that will become an ongoing part of how we deal with that increasing adaptability on the part of those who seek to do us harm.
Honourable Member, for your intervention. I think any threat that this country faces is continuously reviewed by the Ministry of Defence, MI5, the police and the government, and we adapt our approaches to suit. And that brings me on to the fact that in 2017, MI5 and the police have disrupted 43 late-stage attacks, yet we have seen 15 domestic terror attacks in this country. And these incidents underline the ongoing and difficult nature of the threats. And I'm sure the whole House will agree that we have the finest intelligence services in the world, and we owe it to them to enable their work as much as we possibly can from this place. And this bill is another step in achieving that. The approach it proposes is both practical and proportionate for small and large venues. And I commend the government for engaging widely in the development of this bill and for working with businesses, local authorities and security experts to ensure it's both effective and proportionate. And it's right that we in this House support the bill And in doing so, we send a clear message that we will not only remember those we have lost, but we will act decisively to protect those we serve.
Hear, hear.
I call Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. During the course of this debate about the cross-party consensus and what a good thing that is. And in some senses, that's absolutely right. I think we should have absolute cross-party consensus in honouring the memory of Martin Hett and all those who were killed and injured in the Manchester Arena attack back in May 2017. But I raise a note of caution because sometimes when we stop being adversarial in this place, we create legislation which is not as good as it could be. And where, particularly the case where you have a very emotive issue such as this, and where there's a huge amount of personal sympathy right across all the parties in this House. And there is a risk that where you have extreme circumstances, they provoke a natural reaction where you say something must be done, this has to be prevented from ever happening again, and you end up with bad law. And there's a good example of that in the progression of the development of this bill from the last administration through the election and out the other side, because you just need to look at Clause 2. And the initial intention was that the standard duty would apply, Madam Deputy Speaker, for premises with 100 plus capacity to welcome 100 plus people to it. In my view, that would have been a wholly disproportionate impact on the kind of community buildings that I represent as a church warden and then at village halls that we've talked about already this evening. Because pretty much every village hall has a capacity to have 100 people. Every church, bar the very smallest chapels, can from time to time welcome or expect to see 100 people in a wedding or a funeral. And yet, in those kind of rural, typically, areas, there is a tiny risk of terrorism, an infinitesimally small risk of terrorism, and yet this proposed legislation in its previous form, under the previous administration, would have imposed very significant costs, as well as time commitment from volunteers. And I've already mentioned a couple of times that I'm a church warden in another role, and I just repeat the risk of unintended consequences where we're all too keen to get on with each other, where we don't challenge. Yes, I will. The right honourable gentleman.
Just to reassure my honourable friend on that subject, he will understand that those who have served on the Intelligence Security Committee are fearless in holding ministers to account, as this minister will no doubt find out, and similarly fearless in challenging the agencies who do such a wonderful job for us, but he's right, do need to be questioned appropriately and scrutinised fully. So just to assure that. And on the second point about proportionality, of course it's right that our response to risk measures the real character of that risk and is proportionate to it.
I'm very grateful for the intervention of the right honourable gentleman. I am reassured by the comments that he made. In a previous life, I was a barrister specialising in health and safety risk and risk management, and then I was the managing director of a leisure company, you may have heard of it, Go Ape, and I was responsible for the risk management of over 1 million customers a year coming to that facility, and we could have killed every single one of them. So I'm deeply familiar in the appropriate mechanisms of risk management, and one of the risks that you have to take into account is that if your response is too great, too onerous for the assessed risk, then you run the risk of people not thinking it's reasonable. Yeah. And then you get omission. It's crucially important for effective risk management for the mitigation that you put in place to bear some relation with the severity of the adverse event which you're anticipating, multiplied by its likelihood. And in the case of certainly the initial assessment of the previous administration that these duties should apply for premises with as few as 100 people able to get into the premises, then I am very concerned that association between a reasonable response to an assessed risk would have been broken. So I'm very grateful to the government and impressed that they have listened and over the course of the last period and have changed clause subclause 2C, so that the standard duty premises starts at the figure of 200. And to my mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, that does seem to be a reasonable compromise to protect smaller facilities, those facilities which are, of course, the ones most likely to rely 100% on volunteers and not have either the financial capacity to undertake the kind of paid-for training that was suggested by the Liberal Democrats in New Clause 2, or to have the number of volunteers who are prepared to have this as an additional burden on their free time. And so I think this is about the right balance. But as a result, I'm very concerned by Clause 32. Clause 32A brings in the power by regulations to reduce that figure back down to 100. No reason given. Why is that? So I do support New Clause 25 and New Clause 26 to have 200 as the minimum for the standard and 500 as the minimum for the enhanced process. And it's on this basis, after all, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we've had this cross-party approach, that we've had the support that has taken this bill this far, and I think it's important that it's maintained.
Michael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I join other members in paying tribute to Fiega Murray for the tenacity and courage with which she has campaigned, a campaign that has done so much to bring us to this point. I mean, any of us who've been touched, even indirectly, by a terrorist attack know the pain involved in suffering, in the loss and the shock. But that pain is only made worse if there is a suspicion that anything, no matter how slight, might have been done to have avoided or to have reduced the harm done by that terrorist attack. And so, in fighting this campaign, Mrs. Murray really has done Martin's memory proud. Yeah. And as has been obvious throughout this debate, there is a huge amount of consensus around the need for the measures in this bill. And it is a good bill. The draft bill before the election was a good draft. It was improved by pre-legislative scrutiny, and the bill that the government has brought forward and that has come out of committee is better. It is not for us tonight to be deciding whether or not we want these measures, because I think without exception we agree we do. The decision that we have is what can be done to make this the very best bill that it can be, that provides those protections that are so clearly needed, that we've heard from witnesses in those evidence sessions and throughout debate around this bill, both within and outside of this House, without putting an unnecessary burden on those venues that is not needed for the purpose that we seek. And it is precisely because I think that this bill has broadly struck the right note that I rise to support Amendments 25 and 26, tabled in the names of my honourable friend, the Shadow Minister and Shadow Home Secretary. And in doing so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest relating to hospitality, although I don't intend to speak primarily on the hospitality sector, but on the voluntary sector and voluntary-run venues. And I think in particular to a venue in the constituency that I represented until the general election of this year, Brierley Hill Civic, a medium-sized venue in the Black Country that about a decade ago the process started to transfer, an asset transfer from Dudley Council to Dudley CVS. And over that time, Dudley CVS has done a fantastic job, really professional job in every sense of the word, in providing a first-class venue for the area. It will typically have events, not every week, but throughout the year, it will have a few events that will top 500. It won't get as far as 800. I think the standard duties that are in this bill are absolutely appropriate for a venue like Brierley Hill Civic. The concern would be the enhanced duty, how Dudley CVS, primarily through volunteers, would be able to fulfil those enhanced duties if they were suddenly if the thresholds were suddenly to be lower, taking them into an enhanced duty premises. And I think it would cause them great difficulty on a practical level, as well as the financial, as well as in terms of balancing the books, as they must do as a non-profit making organisation. And I think that 800 threshold is right. It will mean that venues like Brierley Hill Civic wouldn't get dragged into those onerous burdens. But I am concerned around that clause 32 could see them, even in a hypothetical situation, could see them facing burdens that they are simply ill-equipped to carry out. And my worry is also if venues that are run by the voluntary sector, like at Brierley Hill Civic, what impact does it have on the decisions they make to invest in potentially expanding their capacity, either around 500 or further, if they think that by doing so, a future Secretary of State may use the powers within clause 32 to lower those thresholds, and so those investments at the same time as costing the money would lead to additional burdens that all of the evidence, the extensive consultation that the Security Minister has rightly said has been done to get to that 800 figure. If that was lowered and dragging in organisations like Dudley CVS, I think would be dangerous. The honourable member for Macclesfield, who's sadly no longer in his place, had said that it would be sad to water down this bill in any way, and I agree. We do not seek to dilute, to water down, to diminish any part of what is in this bill. But what we're worried about is the use of powers of delegated legislation to fundamentally change who the provisions of this bill, as it has been brought to this House at this point, who it applies to. It was not long ago that members of the Minister's party would attack at every opportunity anything that resembled Henry VIII powers. And I worry that a sudden conversion in government has seen them a little bit too relaxed about falling back on these delegated powers in a way that's not needed. If it's turned out at a later date that the government wanted to bring substantially more organisations, more venues into the provisions of this bill at either level, it can come back. It can come back with primary legislation. We can debate it, we can consider it, but that is not what is being proposed today, and that is why I will be voting for the amendments 25 and 26 tonight. I think this is a good bill, but we should not roll back the progress that the government has rightly made. We should stick to the thresholds that are set out on the face of this bill.
I call Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, and first of all, can I say I can fully understand the reasoning and the demand that there was for a bill such as this when it was known that after a terrorist event, because of bad organisation, lives were lost. And of course, if it is possible to introduce legislation which helps to avoid a situation which we have seen develop in the past, then of course we should do it. But I think we've got to be cognizant all the time that when we introduce legislation, it does have consequences for the people who it applies to. And we have heard time and time again throughout this debate that members believe that this legislation is both proportionate and practical. And if that is the case, and if members genuinely believe that that's the case, then there is absolutely no reason why new Clause 1 should not be supported. Because all it is seeking to do is we're entering a new field, we're bringing new regulations on bodies which weren't regulated in relation to terrorism before. And surely, if we're doing that, it's important that we find out whether or not the objective and the intention is actually fulfilled. And the one way of doing that is to monitor in a period of time what the effect has been. I have some concerns about the legislation, and people have raised them already today, because I don't believe that in many cases they are practical. And secondly, I don't believe that they will not have an impact which members did not expect, and indeed which members have already said it right across this House don't want to happen, i.e. that it puts people off from engaging in activities which, in the absence of these regulations, they would have engaged in and make a valuable contribution to their own communities in doing so. And the concerns I have, I hope, and the danger always is, of course, that people interpret some of the legislation which comes through here, and sometimes our own rhetoric encourages them in doing so. They think that the result of this will be that it will reduce the danger of people suffering a terrorist attack. And we've got to make something clear. That is not, and that cannot be, the purpose of this bill. Terrorist attacks can only be stopped if we've got intelligence, the security forces can act on it, and we act in time. All of this is doing, and the member from, I think it was East Edinburgh, pointed out this is more about what happens after the event. But it's not only about what happens after the event. This puts obligations on people before they make a decision whether to undertake an event. And some of the wording in the bill, I think, does raise some concerns. Yes, go away.
Gentlemen, for giving way. Just to clarify, I wasn't saying it was only of value after an event. I said that part of its value was the impact it had on planning for after an event. But that burden that he's talking about of people making preparations, wouldn't he accept that it is important that they consider the potential impact of events and think in advance about it in taking their decisions? Because that's how we avoid the kind of atrocities that we've seen.
You know, if we look at some of the, and let's just look at some of the language in the bill and the requirements in the bill, which are totally reasonable. I mean, for example, that those people who are organising an event should have plans for evacuating individuals from premises. Now, as far as I know, that already happens. I mean, I don't know how many events I go to, and before the event even starts, somebody stands up and says, here's some house rules. In the event of a fire, the exits are here, 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 and here, and you leave in an early way. And when you get outside, you meet at certain points so we can check that everybody is out of the thing and everything. So there are issues, there are things here which I believe are reasonable, and I would assume people are already doing. And if they're not doing, then of course it's not onerous on them at the beginning of an event to tell that. Though I've got to say, this applies to retail as well. And it's easy to communicate that kind of information to people if they're in a theatre or they're in some kind of concert or whatever. bit more difficult to communicate that to individuals when they're moving in and out of retail premises. And again, I think that we've just got to be careful in the practicalities of some of the things we ask people to do. But here are some of the things I do have concerns about, which I believe are unreasonable to require from organisers. First of all, the protection measures and procedures have to be followed by individuals working on premises or at an event if there is reason to suspect that an act of terrorism is occurring or is about to occur on the premises. Now, occurring, I suppose, is fairly obvious. It's happening. You know that there's something happening. Likely to occur or about to occur. Are organisers meant to liaise with the police, get intelligence from the police, intelligence that may or may not be able to divulge or even have? What onus does that put on the individuals? To, first of all, in preparation, are we likely to be subject? And given the random nature of terrorism now, we have seen somebody going into a preschool class with a knife. Nobody could have anticipated that, but that's the first thing. And then the second thing is this, that while the event is occurring or might occur, they have got to prevent individuals from entering the premises. Now, what kind of a security requirement? If I were organising the event, I would want to know what kind of security requirement does that put on me as the organiser to prevent people from entering the premises? Am I meant to have a security presence there? What kind of security presence? And don't forget, we have talked quite a lot tonight about the fact that many of these events of 200 people could be organised by ordinary community groups. I can think of theatre groups in my own constituency. The only interest that people have is acting. They don't have any other of the kind of skills that might be required to prevent people entering the premises. So again, do they have to have security apparatus, security people, or whatever? And then the next one, where I think there was a degree of ambiguity, was that one of the measures is that they can't divulge security information in relation to the premises or the event. Now, I can understand that, of course, the organisers should not be sending out, here's the plans for the building we're going to be operating in, and there's the doors you can come in, and there's the doors you can get out, and there's the easy way into the premises, and there's the hard way out of it. But it goes further than that. You can't give information about the event. Now, the whole purpose of an event is that you publicise it. Where is it going to be held? What time is it going to be held? How many people can it facilitate? How do you get the tickets for it? And everything else. So, the point I'm trying to make is this, that there is language in this bill that if I were the group or the individual who was subject to this legislation, I would have a lot of questions. And I'll tell you why I would have a lot of questions. Because, see, if I don't get it right, there's a fine of up to £5,000 or £10,000. I will guess.
And would he agree with me that he's making a compelling case to support the Liberal Democrat new clause 2 to provide training to address some of the ambiguity, exactly what he's talking about here?
Well, in fact, the training, I don't believe, would address the ambiguity, because the ambiguity is actually in the legislation. The ambiguity is in the wording of the law which people will be required to respond to. The training element, I can see, I mean, we all know what happens with training schools and everything else. As soon as you mention training, people start rubbing their hands and think, how much am I going to charge for this? For a one-off event. And so I think that we've got to be careful when we introduce legislation like this, that we do not puts such a burden. I know people have said it's not a burden, but it is a burden. And I hope I've explained why I believe it puts a burden on people whose main job is not security. And I can understand common sense requirements being made of organiser events. But if their main job is not the kind of security of these kind of events, then they're more likely simply to drop them. The second thing that I have concerns about, and it's one of the reasons why I would support the amendments about the ability of the Secretary of State to change regulations. Because the ability of the Secretary of State to change the regulations does not just go to the size of the premises, which can be defined in the legislation, moving it down, but it also the purpose of the use, what the premises are going to be used to by, the people who can be held responsible, and the scope of the premises which can be covered. So in clause 32, the powers to amend are fairly extensive. And of course, if the Secretary of State decides that there's going to be changes along the nature of those 4 areas, then what we're approving here tonight could be radically different in a year's time or whatever, because of course the review is dependent upon whether or not there's a need to reduce the vulnerability in clause 6, subparagraph 5. If there's a need to reduce the vulnerability of attacks, of events. Now, what happens if, and terrorists are of course very adaptable to these things. Large-scale events are a bit harder to attack, so you go to small-scale events. And we have found this in Northern Ireland. I mean, a member for Strangford mentioned terrorists, when they couldn't get through the security cordons in big towns and everything else, what did they do? They went to mission halls where there was maybe 40 worshippers in the middle of the country. And they then became the targets, or earnings halls, or pubs, small country pubs. So terrorists will be adaptable, and I have no doubt that there will be an outcry at some stage, because what we have anticipated as terrorist vulnerabilities, they've changed, and there's maybe smaller venues. So do we go down to 100, go down to 50? And that's why I think that there should not be the ability of the Secretary of State to change these regulations without coming back, so that we don't find that we place burdens and we introduce regulations on individuals who it was never intended to, and who indeed would find it impossible to comply with them. And those are the reasons why I will support the new Clause 1 and the amendments in relation to the powers of the Secretary of State. And I think that all members, because don't forget, this is, I know it's always difficult when the government's proposing it and for members to vote against their own party. But don't forget, this is going to affect activities, premises, organisations and businesses in every one of our constituencies. And for that reason, we ought to be very careful what we vote through tonight.
Minister Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by paying tribute to Fegan Murray and her campaign team? That she has somehow been able to channel personal grief into a fierce determination to change the law is beyond inspiring. I think we should be clear about the fact that we would not be here tonight without her campaigning efforts, and I think the whole House owes her a debt of gratitude. I'd like to thank all honourable and right honourable members who have spoken today, and as ever I will endeavour to respond to the points that have been raised. I have to say I am particularly grateful for the constructive approach that has been taken to considering this bill today and at previous stages, and I would like to place on record my thanks to the opposition for the constructive way in which they have approached this bill throughout its passage. It is time that this cross-party commitment to improve the safety and security of venues is delivered without further delay, and I am proud that we are moving one step closer to this tonight. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as honourable members have heard during passage so far, the threat picture is complex, evolving and enduring. We know that since 2017, agencies and law enforcement have disrupted 43 late-stage plots and there have been 15 domestic terror attacks. And in October, we heard from the Director General of MI5 that the country is subject to the most interconnected threat environment we have ever seen. We also sadly know that terrorists can seek to target a variety of locations. The examples of terrorist attacks that have been raised during passage are a sombre reminder of that. I pay tribute again to all victims and survivors of past attacks, as well as to their loved ones and all those affected. And I reiterate this government's commitment to supporting anyone who is affected by a terrorist attack.
Will the Minister give way?
I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable and gallant friend for giving way. I congratulate him and indeed the party opposite on this bill. Of course, all of us across this House hope that future attacks will be prevented by this bill, but as my honourable friends have mentioned in this debate, it is also about planning to ensure that the increased survivability of those impacted by an attack, and of course with that comes a need to ensure that the support we provide to victims is fit for purpose. And so can I ask the Minister about the efforts he will make to improve support for victims of terrorism?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I think he raises an important point. One of the most humbling parts of this job is meeting with those who've been the victims of terrorism and their families. I think of people like Fegan Murray, Brendan Cox, Travis Frayne, Dr. Kath Hill, all people that I've spoken to recently. And I can tell my honourable friend that we are working across government to progress this important work. And I intend to meet with victims and survivors in the new year to hear more about their experiences and to say more about what we're going to do as a government to support them. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill will improve protective security and organisational preparedness across the UK, making us safer. And we've heard about the excellent work that many businesses and organisations already do to improve their security and preparedness. However, without a legislative requirement, we know that there will be no consistency, and this bill seeks to address that gap and to complement the outstanding work that the police, the security services and other partners continue to do to combat the terror threat. As a result, qualifying premises and events should be better prepared to respond and reduce harm in the event of a terrorist attack. Additionally, certain larger premises and events will also have to take steps to reduce their vulnerability to terrorist attacks. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the public have a right to feel safe, and this is what this legislation seeks to deliver. Now, I am very grateful for the considered way in which the Honourable Member for Stockton West has approached this debate, and it is clear that the focus of the opposition's amendments and their concerns is, amongst other things, the impact on business and smaller organisations. I can assure him that this has been a central consideration for the government, informed by extensive engagement as well as pre-legislative scrutiny by the Home Affairs Select Committee and 2 public consultations under the previous government. And as a result, the version of the bill that this government has brought forward includes important changes to ensure we can both achieve public protection outcomes and ensure that there are no undue burdens on businesses and other organisations. The government has, of course, raised the standard tier threshold from 100 to 200, which we believe creates a more appropriate scope. We have also added a reasonably practical standard of requirements for the procedures required under both tiers. This concept is in line with other regulatory regimes, such as health and safety, and is designed to allow procedures and measures to be tailored at the specific circumstances of a premises or event. I will.
The Minister giving way, mindful of what he said about consulting and acting in accord with that consultation, and what I said earlier about the changing character of the threat, will he commit from the dispatch box to, as this legislation begins to have effect, consider changing guidance where necessary, improving regulation where necessary, sensitive to those circumstances?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. If he just bears with me for a moment, there is more that I intend to say about it, but I give him an assurance if he's not satisfied, I'll give way to him again. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was saying that we've introduced a fairer basis for calculating whether a premise or event is in scope, replacing capacity with reasonable expectation of the number of people who may be present. This will reflect the actual usage of premises or attendance at events, and I am confident that the version of the bill brought forward strikes precisely the right balance. I'll turn now to the specific amendments 25 and 26 tabled by the Honourable Member and by the Opposition. Clause 32 will allow the Secretary of State to increase or decrease the qualifying threshold for either tier. Now, we anticipate that the thresholds would only be reduced to either floor in very limited circumstances, such as if the nature of the threat from terrorism were to change significantly. This will enable the regime to maintain an appropriate balance between being able to protect the public and manage the burden on those responsible for premises and events. The amendments proposed would remove this ability. Furthermore, this power is narrowly drafted, and regulations made under it will be subject to the affirmative procedure in requiring the approval of both houses before they are made. Parliamentarians will be able to scrutinise any proposed changes. So the Government therefore does not support these amendments. Turning to Amendment 27, and I thank the Honourable Member for this amendment, and I thought that he made his points in a very reasonable way, as he often does. And whilst I understand the sentiment that the Government does not support it, but let me explain why. It is intended that the Security Industry Authority will rely on advice and guidance in the first instance. However, a credible enforcement regime with suitable monetary penalties is necessary to ensure that the regulator can secure compliance, particularly where the regulator identifies serious or non-persistent compliance. The maximum daily penalty amounts are set at a level to counter financial gain from non-compliance, recognising the breadth of organisations in scope, as well as the potentially more serious consequences at larger venues. It is important that the Secretary of State has the power by regulations to change these maximum amounts, including to increase them if necessary. For example, if the amounts were to prove ineffective in ensuring compliance, or the figures needed updating to reflect changes in economic circumstances in the longer term. Critically, when determining penalty amounts, the bill requires the SIA to take into account a range of factors, including the seriousness of the contravention, any action taken to remedy or mitigate its effects, and an organisation's ability to pay. This will ensure that the penalties are effective but proportionate. I can also reassure members that changes will be subject to the affirmative procedure unless they are simply to reflect inflation. Now, the Honourable Member has also raised concerns over the role of the Security Industry Authority as the regulator, which I believe is the motivation for tabling Amendment New Clause 1. Now, there are several reasons why the Government does not support this amendment. The Government is confident that the SIA is the right delivery option for the Martins Law regulator, owing to its years of experience in increasing security standards and ensuring public protection. It already plays an important role in safeguarding the public through its work regulating the private security industry, and the SIA has long established inspection and enforcement functions which ensure compliance with its licensing regime, and it already works with security partners to promote best practice around counter-terrorism. If the Honourable Member would just bear with me, because I think I'm going to address some of the points that he raised earlier. Furthermore, it will take at least 24 months following royal assent for the SIA to begin undertaking its enforcement duties. So it would not be fair of us, nor indeed possible, to judge their performance before it has begun carrying out its new functions, which would seem to be the effect of this proposed new clause. I'm just going to make a bit of progress. I can also assure the House that the bill already contains provisions that will ensure appropriate oversight of the SIA. Ultimately, the bill gives the SIA the tools that it will need to deliver its new enforcement functions successfully, and we are committed to exploring wider opportunities to strengthen the SIA in relation to its public protection role and deliver this government's ambitious agenda. I now want to turn to the amendments tabled by the Honourable Member for North Cornwall in respect of training provision. I thank him again for his interest on this important issue, and again he's made an important contribution to the debate. As he knows, the bill has been developed to ensure that those working at premises and events are better prepared to respond quickly to evolving situations in the event of a terrorist attack occurring or being suspected. It is these workers who make rapid decisions and carry out actions that could save lives. There is no specific training requirement on the face of the bill. However, it is essential that workers with responsibility for carrying out these public protection procedures are adequately instructed and, where appropriate, trained to do so. Accordingly, training and instruction will be tailored to the premises and events in question and the procedures that they have developed, rather than a one-size-fits-all. Just going to make a bit more progress. The government considers that the focus of premises and events should be on how to ensure their people can effectively carry out their roles, rather than requiring the completion of generic modules or courses. The government understands the vital importance of training and as such has committed to publishing free, dedicated guidance and support. This guidance will ensure that those responsible for qualifying premises and events have the required information to understand and identify training needs. Now, it's also intended that a range of training offers will be signposted, and this will include the significant support that the government offers in the shape of access to expert advice and training on Protect UK, which already includes free access to Action Counters Terrorism and See, Check and Notify training packages. Furthermore, following royal assent, the government intends for there to be an implementation period of at least 24 months before the legislation is commenced. This will, we are confident, allow sufficient time to understand the new obligations and to plan and prepare accordingly, including training staff as needed. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious of time, but I do want to respond to a number of points that have been made by honourable members. The honourable member for Macclesfield made important points about the threat from terrorism. He also rightly paid tribute to Manchester City Council and the work that they've done with their local businesses. I think in terms of proportionality, that should reassure any businesses that might have concerns. The honourable member for the Forest of Dean, as a former police officer, he speaks with great authority on these matters, and I pay tribute to him for his service. He rightly made the point that the bill isn't just about securing physical premises, but there's a wider value to it, and also that protecting the public isn't just a matter for government, and that all others also have an important responsibility in this area. Now, turning to the honourable member for Hamble Valley, and he's been very patient. I have to say, I'm a little bit mystified as to why he's not on his front bench. He seems like a very effective performer, and he responded very well at second reading. I'm not sure I'm helping him, but I thought he made a very strong contribution again tonight, and I have to say I found his words about Martin's legacy particularly moving, and I'm grateful this evening, as I was previously, for his constructive approach. He helpfully, I think, outlined concerns specifically about smaller venues, and he referenced smaller theatres. Can I take the opportunity to ensure him that there's been extensive consultation with smaller venues? I'm sorry that didn't include the particular one in his constituency, but all honourable members will know, because we all have village halls, churches or community halls in our own constituencies, and all of us will recognise the hugely important role that volunteers play. That is exactly why the government raised the standard tier threshold from 100 to 200, specifically in response to the feedback that was received, including from those operating smaller venues, very similar to the ones that he mentioned. We assess that this has resulted in a reduction in village halls coverage from 56% under the original proposals to now only 13% of village halls now being in scope of the bill's requirements. But I give him an assurance that we will continue to work very closely with those smaller venues to ensure the easiest of sort of transition to these new arrangements. The honourable member for Edinburgh East and Musselburgh made the point that the nature of terrorism is constantly evolving and that we need to plan to protect against that. And he pointed out that the bill contains straightforward measures, essentially prompts that are light touch and proportionate. He also very helpfully referenced the Edinburgh example, and again I hope that that provides a positive evidence of the potential benefits that businesses will accrue as a consequence of this. The Honourable Member for Strangford was constructive, as he always is, and as someone who speaks with great experience on and authority on matters relating to terrorism, I always listen very carefully to what he has to say. And I often find what he has to say profoundly moving, and I did again tonight. He raised the issue which he raised previously with me of churches, and the government acknowledges that places of worship have a unique and important role in communities right across the country, and the government have considered them in the context of this legislation very carefully. We have consulted extensively with churches, with places of worship more generally, and I can assure him that we will continue to work closely with them to make sure that they have the necessary support and guidance they need. And that is a commitment that I make from me to him. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to keep going. Not least because I just want to briefly reflect on the contribution made by the Honourable Member for Dover and Deal. He spoke with personal conviction and experience. I know that he understands the importance of prior preparation and planning, and he took the opportunity rightly to pay tribute to, I won't say the second bit of that particular phraseology, but he was right to take the opportunity this evening to pay tribute to our intelligence services, and I echo the tribute that he made. Now, the Honourable Member for Broadland and Fakenham spoke with authority not just as a member of this House, but also as a church warden. I thought he made a really interesting point about critical challenge. I would just sort of say to him, and I hope that he would appreciate the point I'm seeking to make, that this bill is as a result of a very extensive public consultation, 2 public consultations, and pre-legislative scrutiny. And it is forged from all of that work. And that is why I am confident to be able to say to him that the measures contained within it I believe to be proportionate and reasonable. But I was grateful for the constructive challenge that he offered. The Honourable Member for Kingswinford and South Staffordshire made a number of constructive points around thresholds, and I hope the responses that I've given already have provided him and the venue in his constituency the reassurance that they want. The member for East Antrim spoke with passion, as he always does. He raised a number of, I think, entirely reasonable concerns, and whilst I'm afraid I don't think that we're going to agree on every aspect of them this evening, I hope that he will at least acknowledge that we've worked as a government incredibly hard to ensure that the measures that are within this bill are proportionate and, given the nature of the threat that we face, not unreasonable. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to incredibly briefly touch on the government amendments which make only very minor and technological changes to the bill to ensure its purpose and intent is clear. They include small drafting changes for consistency, to remove unnecessary text and to clarify technical detail. In closing, I would again like to take a moment to pay tribute and to thank Fegan Murray and her campaign team. Their campaigning for this legislation has been an inspiration to us all. Fegan's son, Martin, lost his life in the Manchester bombing. As the Home Secretary said at second reading, to suffer such a horrendous loss and somehow find the strength to fight for change is heroic. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a vitally important bill. The public deserve to feel safe when visiting public premises and attending events. It is therefore right that appropriate and reasonably practical steps should be taken to protect staff and the public from the impact of terrorism. That is what this bill seeks to achieve. Security will always be the foundation upon which everything else is built. And for this government, nothing will matter more. With that, I commend this bill to the House.
Shadow Minister Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for his considered response to this debate. However, while entirely supporting the objectives of the bill, we do not see why the Government cannot commit to a review of the effectiveness of the Security Industry Authority as the regulator, given this is an entirely new set of requirements for venues and an entirely new set of responsibilities for the Security Industry Authority. I'd like to move new clause 1.
The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Rebecca Paul, Richard Holden. Tellers for the noes, Kay Mather, Taiwo Awatami.
The ayes to the right, 89. The noes to the left, 340.
The ayes to the right were 89. The noes to the left were 340. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. With the leave of the House, I shall put a single question on the Government Amendments 1 to 24. I call the Minister to move the amendments formally.
Move formally.
The question is that the Government Amendments 1 to 24 be made. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Consideration completed. Third reading. King's consent. Minister to move third reading, Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time. And I'd like to start by thanking everyone across this House who has contributed to the debates on this bill for their incisive and necessary contributions and their considered scrutiny. I would particularly like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Selby and Kippax, who's done such an excellent job in whipping this bill through. And I also want to thank the Right Honourable Member for Tonbridge and the Honourable Member for Hamble Valley for their work on the opposition front bench at the earliest stages of this bill. And I also want to thank the Honourable Member for Stockton West for taking over the bill at report stage so ably, and I look forward to continuing to work with him in his new role. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, members will be aware of the history of this bill, coming as it does out of the tragic events of the Manchester Arena attack in May of 2017. And I take this opportunity this evening once more to pay tribute to the 22 victims of the horrific Manchester Arena attack and to Fegan Murray, mother of one of the victims, Martin Hett. Her campaigning has been crucial in driving this bill forward, and we simply would not be here debating this legislation without her. Now, during these debates, I have been particularly moved by the contributions of honourable members for constituencies who have spoken on behalf of their constituents who have been affected by the attacks in Manchester, Borough Market and elsewhere, and also the important reflections and lessons we can learn from recent history in Northern Ireland. This bill is one part of our already extensive efforts across government, including those of the police and the security services, to combat the threat of terrorism. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank them for their vital work in keeping our country safe. We owe them a debt of gratitude. As members of this House have heard me say more than once in this place, the first responsibility of any government is to keep the public safe. And this cross-party commitment to improve the safety and security of venues in the wake of the Manchester Arena attack must be delivered without further delay. This bill was a manifesto commitment, and I am proud that we have been able to introduce it so early in this session. And I would like to thank colleagues from across the House for their support of this bill, which has enabled it to progress through its stages in this place so smoothly. I am also, of course, grateful to the previous membership of the Home Affairs Select Committee for their report, whose recommendations have been crucial in shaping the current bill. And I also want to take the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to say an enormous thank you to Ella Terry in my private office, to the bill team of Tom Ball, Chloe White, James Fair and Izzy Hancock, Michelle Chapman and the policy team, Chris Lee and his legal team, Joel Watchover and Tim McAteny at the Office of the Parliamentary Council, and Debbie Bartlett and Sean Hipgrave, whose leadership over several years now has been exemplary. I'd also like to thank all the many civil servants, including those in the Home Office Analysis and Insight and Comms team, who have worked on this bill with great diligence and professionalism. Many of them have done so now for several years. Finally, I would like to take the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to thank the fantastic staff of this place for their work supporting the logistics of this bill, particularly the doorkeepers and the parliamentary clerks team. And I would like to finish with a gentle word of encouragement to colleagues in the other place. It has been wonderful to see that we have consensus on this bill in this place, and I hope that they will agree with us on the importance of the bill and that this manifesto commitment can proceed as smoothly through the other place as it has done here. After several years, and as Fegan has said, it's time to get this done. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. I call the Shadow Minister, Matt Vickers.
Madam Deputy Speaker, recent years have seen too many tragedies and too many precious lives taken by terrorist attacks, hurt which will never truly heal. Yet despite these tragedies, inspirational people like Fegan Murray and Survivors Against Terror have shown us good can come from bad. And the power is in our hands to act, even in the shadow of grief. Martin's Law and everyone who has worked to make it a reality are an embodiment of this spirit. Implementing this legislation will require us all to work together. National security is a collective endeavour. Organisations affected by these changes are acutely aware of their responsibility. They understand the importance of protecting their customers from terror and are committed to ensuring that people can attend concerts, exhibitions and performances with the confidence that they are safe. It's in this spirit of collaboration and mutual responsibility which will ultimately make the provisions in Martin's Law a success. This responsibility goes both ways. Just as we expect venues to take the necessary steps in this bill, they expect the government to approach its implementation in a measured and sensible manner. I want to finish by thanking the government for continuing the important work on this bill and to reiterate to the Minister my willingness to work with him on its passing and implementation going forward. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Hear, hear.